hosted by ESI as a part of our Wildlife Week 2023 is starting here. We have our first speaker, Dr. Meghna Krishnadas from CCMB. She's an MBBS graduate from Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, Bangalore, India. She, before joining the field of research, worked as a physician for some time, treating people in the forest. From a doctor to an activist to a researcher, her life is an interesting journey. Today, she'll be talking about global climatic changes and their impact on our lives. Persuasive factors such as habitat loss, climate change, nutrient deposition, etc. impose individual and interactive force on plants and animals that result in changes that span from genes to ecosystems, collectively termed global environmental changes. Today, she'll be talking more on this and she'll highlight the importance of framing and understanding the impact of global environmental change from first principles of ecological theory. The stage is all yours, Meghna ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks, Fatima. Good evening to all of you who are here. I can't see how many people are here right now because I'm just staring at my screen. But while I was waiting, I saw that quite a few of you had joined. And it's very heartening for me to see so much interest in ecology and in these matters related to wildlife and conservation. So it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity, and it was very nice to know that there is this club at your institution, and I'm very much honored to have this opportunity to be able to give this talk and be a part of this series of events. Right. So I'm not sure how you guys do this. I can, if you have any questions, again, like I said, I can't see what's going on. So are we going to take questions towards the very end, or would someone tell me if there's questions in between?
We'll take the questions at the end. We can continue with the presentations for now.
Okay. Right. All right. Thank you. Okay. So I will start then. Just checking if you can see my slide change.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you for that confirmation. All right. So I'm assuming that for most people here, this map that I have presented of the globe, of the planet that we live in, is quite obvious, and a knowledge that is quite obvious. Our planet, Earth, is changing pretty rapidly. In fact, so rapidly that remote sensing analyses tell us that over the last 20-25 years itself, most places on Earth have seen an increase of very close to 1 degree in their mean land surface temperatures and sea surface temperatures, actually, but perhaps prominently so over land. And as a result, and associated with that, there's been melting of the ice sheets across the world, and there has been a dramatic or a fairly dramatic rise in sea levels, going up to even 20 centimeters in some places. Now, these may not sound like very large numbers, but as we will see, even in Earth's previous geological past, even small shifts in the stability of the climate on Earth has led to massive changes in the life that has been on Earth during that time. And we are going through a similar phase now. And a lot of what I will talk to you about today is to synthesize or try and give you a highlight of how scientists have been approaching this problem of the impact of these global environmental changes on biodiversity that we find on Earth. Now, global environmental change that we talk about, this rise in sea surface temperature, terrestrial temperatures, or rise in sea levels, is but one part of a larger gamut of changes that's taking place on Earth. And these changes have primarily been implemented or have happened because of human actions, particularly since the dawn of the industrial era. Over the last couple of 100 years or so, in search of food, fuel, space, and other kinds of resources that human societies need, and those needs have grown as our populations have increased tremendously, we have altered the nature of how energy flows through Earth's system, and therefore of how these interconnected processes, like processes that happen at geological time scales and processes that happen at large spatial scales, are now happening on Earth. So what we know of climate change is but one part of a very large set of changes, such as emission of greenhouse gases, changes in how we use energy, how we have removed or altered large parts of the Earth's terrestrial or even marine systems in search of, for agriculture and harvesting food, leading to changes in the water cycle, leading to changes in the geological, biogeochemical cycling, etc. And many of these changes have sort of shifted, as I said, these systems towards tipping points. And scientists for the last 20 years or so have been talking and warning humanity. There have been these papers which talk about, warnings to humanity for Earth reaching its tipping points. And in the last couple of years, especially since 2017 onwards, um, evidence seems to suggest that we are reaching some of those tipping points on these Earth. For example, in 2017, the Amazon rainforest and the boreal forest actually went from being the world's largest carbon sinks to prominent carbon sources, which means that now instead of taking the carbon in and holding it there, these forests are now releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. And we'll come to why some of that is happening, and including these shifts in like how dust storms are moving, what kind of circulation currents are moving through the oceans. And I'm sure many of you would already know this. And in this large framework of many, many changes that are happening, biodiversity is being affected. This is an obvious statement, right? But majorly what we are seeing is that the nature of life, the organization of life from the level of genes to ecosystems, is today being affected by these massive global scale changes that human activities are mediating on this planet. And some of these changes are, they act synergistically together, and some and independently also they can create many effects on biodiversity, some of which we will go through. Now, of course, all of these changes are big, the effects are big, and these changes can happen, like I mentioned, across multiple scales ranging from genes to ecosystem. So in one discussion it would be impossible to cover all the things that are there, so I'm going to choose a few of these elements which are considered the most dramatic, the most drastic, and also have seen a lot of scientific exploration, and try to use them to illustrate the kind of changes we might expect in the future for biodiversity in on this planet, right? And many of these changes, I'm sure, are familiar to you all. For example, we have been hearing a lot about the massive and repeated bleaching of coral reefs. If anyone has heard or seen the Great Barrier Reef, you must know that over the last 5 or 6 years or so, there have been repeated mass bleaching events in which many different corals died out, large swaths and spaces of coral died out, which had knock-on effects on the biodiversity, such as these fishes and other organisms that inhabit coral reefs, which are like the rainforests of the sea, right? The other event that has been in the news is forest fires in many different places, particularly the fires in California. Some are, I'm sure folks must have heard of it. And these are all events that are happening because of changes to the Earth system, because of changes that are happening at a very large scale, but having consequences at very local scales for biodiversity. So, for example, changes in the El Nino oscillations, changes in drought conditions, led to massive diebacks of the Amazon rainforest. So diebacks mean that all of a sudden you see this massive death in a large number of trees. And when these trees die, what is happening is suddenly there is this large mass of carbon that is now just going to go back into the atmosphere, right? These organisms which should have lived for many hundreds of years more are not there anymore, and this is disrupting the carbon cycle, like we mentioned, in terms of there being a sudden shift from being a sink to a source. But these kind of massive events which are happening across the globe are also mediating changes at local scales. So in many of these ecosystems, such as boreal forests and the Amazon rainforest, and even savannas in many places. Because of this dieback of trees, there is one, first of all, difference in which species are living and dying and which species are now making up this forest, or which species are dominant or losing out in these forests. And because of these changes to the composition of species, you can have changes, numbers and composition of species. You can have changes in the way energy and water flows through the system, the way nutrients are now being cycled or will be cycled as a knock-on effect of these kind of deaths for the next many years. And drought mediated diebacks also are making forests prone to large fires, which then feed back into these changes in energy, water, and nutrient cycling. And because of changes in which species live and which species die, because not all species are equally affected, you will see that vegetation communities themselves, the ecological community itself, can change. And these changes can sometimes last through many, many decades of time, and the forest doesn't recover. And some of these signals have been seen in studies that have looked at what has happened to ecosystems in response to climatic change occurring over long time periods. I wish we had more such studies, and particularly I wish we had these studies in India, because we don't have too many. But there are places across the world where people have been studying these systems since like 1920s and 30s onwards, or there is data that they try and compare to what's happening in these systems today. And these studies are really important because long-term ecological monitoring reveals to us some of these lagged and cascading effects through time that I was mentioning. Like today, if there is one or two species that completely die out, what might be the effect of that on nutrient cycling and flows, say 20 years? Is there any effect at all? And what kind of effects are there? Long-term studies help us understand some of these things. They help us, or they help reveal how the legacies of human activities continue to influence ecosystems for, way after when these solitary events might have happened, such as a fire or a huge dieback. But perhaps most importantly, these long-term databases help to distinguish what is actually a response to climatic fluctuation and climate-mediated change from short-term or cyclical variations, such as, say, if there is a typhoon that hit it, or if there is one bad year, because if there have always been changes to, say, moisture availability, El Nino circulations, etc. But these long-term data sets are invaluable to tease apart those kind of variations, with what happens at shorter time frames but still maintains a mean, versus what is really shifting systems towards a tipping point that scientists are very much concerned about, right? And one great example of this is the long-term ecological monitoring network that has, that consists of about 28 plots arrayed all across northern United States. And all across these plots since the 1930s, consistently, they have observed that there is increased variability and fluctuation in the temperature and moisture availability in these systems. Disturbances, natural disturbances such as hurricanes and typhoons and forest fires have increased both in frequency and the intensity. And many different kinds of disturbances seem to come up in the same systems today that were not seen before. And as I mentioned, there is now scientific evidence which clearly suggests that these disturbances, sort of individually and together, they are altering primary production, which is how much carbon is being fixed and made into biomass, the cycling of organic and inorganic matters, and they are making changes in the population trajectories of species. Are species able to reproduce and grow and maintain their numbers? And what is the composition of communities made up of different abundances and presence of different species? What is it looking like? So these studies have been invaluable to give us this kind of information. But how many, this is like, how many places, people, or contexts are fortunate enough to have had these studies in place? But these problems still need to be understood. These long-term impacts of what's happening in a changing climate and what it's doing to biodiversity still needs to be understood. And so for the last decade or so, there has been a huge impetus to actually set up experiments across the world. And some of them are like coordinated large-scale experiments that a big group of scientists meets and then sets up at different parts of the world to understand the impact of some of the key drivers that we know are mediating changes to ecosystems and ecological communities. So some of them, such as drought, what the one that you see in the picture here, they have actually set up an experiment in which they have these through fall shelters, and they say that okay, we are going to change the rainfall that comes into this area by an extent that we anticipate will change in the near future. So in some places it's actually adding water and simulating an increasing rainfall. In many places it is simulating a drought. In many places this is combined with nutrient addition or an increase in temperatures, like they make these chambers where they increase local temperatures and how that affects the community in that local area. And scientists are using these kind of experiments to tease apart what might happen to communities based on what kind of species are there, what kind of diversity is there, what kind of traits or features of species make up these communities. So for example, if in some of these places do you have species that are more drought tolerant, and if you have these drought experiments, do they clearly win out, or do they replace the species that are less drought tolerant? What are the features of these species? And here I primarily refer to plants, but very similar things could be examined with animals, but perhaps not in these experimental conditions. But these experiments are now being widely implemented across the world to understand some of these key problems that we are grappling with today. And another cool example of such an experiment, which has now been running, I think, for about 25 to 30, 25 years or so, is in the University of Minnesota. They're called free air carbon dioxide enrichment experiments. So what we started with, one of the major drivers of changes in the Earth system is the fact that we are pumping in so much of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide. So about 25 years ago, people said, hey, why don't we try and see what is the impact of this on different vegetation communities? And they started this in the US, in the using local species in a particular grassland and shrubland community. And they set up these communities with like a single species, with two species, with 4 species and 10 species. And they also imposed certain temperature treatment, nutrient treatments. And this is what you see on the left hand side of the picture. If you can see my cursor move, these are the treatments that were imposed in combination with carbon dioxide enrichment. And this study has now been going on for about 25 years and has yielded some very cool results, to the point that these experiments have been replicated again in similar designs across the world. And now we are even doing this in forests. So this is an example of the U-Face experiment in Australia, where they're trying to replicate the similar thing in a eucalyptus forest. And recently, I think just about a couple of years back, they set up the first such experiment in Amazonian forest, which I think will be the first tropical face experiment to understand the impact of increasing carbon dioxide on tree species or forest responses, right? And for those of you who like numbers, just a couple of insights for why we need such experiments. This 20-year experiment gave some very surprising results for how vegetation might respond, particularly this grassland vegetation they were looking at might respond to elevated carbon dioxide. Now, initially, they started off by making these hypotheses in terms of 2 broad groups of plants, which are called C3 and C4 plants. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, plants use 2 different pathways to photosynthesize, and one can't do the other, right? They're 2 different groups of plants. C4 plants are, they evolved during the drier, more arid times, and they are thought to be more efficient photosynthesizers. But it is argued that when you have an elevated carbon dioxide available, you don't need this kind of efficiency. And now C3 plants would actually be advantaged when there is more carbon dioxide available. But there were also these questions of, oh, but what if there is a drought? What if there's increased temperature? How does that interact? Because do C4 plants also withstand higher temperatures? Will water become a limiting factor? So this face experiment that I showed you in the previous slide was set up to tease apart all of these potential mechanisms by which elevated carbon dioxide might impact these 2 groups of plants. And the initial hypothesis was that C3 plants would do better or gain more biomass and be fitter with elevated carbon dioxide than the C4 plants. Now, on these graphs on the y-axis, a positive number means that the biomass gain for this group has been more when carbon dioxide was elevated compared to the baseline or ambient carbon dioxide. right? And a negative value then means you have lost biomass, or that you are not doing as well in the elevated carbon dioxide condition. So when we see during the early parts of the experiment, as expected, the C4 plants were not doing as well as the C3 plants. Great. Everything went according to the hypothesis. But you let this run for 20 years, and what they found was there was this unexpected reversal of performance. And they wouldn't have known this if they had just done the experiment for 4 or 5 years, illustrating how the hypotheses that we have based on fairly sound scientific principles may still play out very differently in natural systems depending on the time frame at which we look at certain processes, right? So we see that about 20 years after the experiment, very unexpectedly, it was the C4 plants which were actually doing much better in these experiments, right? And because they had this very nice experimental design where they could tease apart whether it's because of temperature or water or nutrient cycling, they found that this had nothing to do with temperature or water. I've not presented the data here, but it seems that most of these changes that they see in biomass was driven by changes in nitrogen cycling that these plants undergo. And it seemed that early on, it is whichever plants or whichever group of plants throughout were able to cycle their nitrogen better, they were the ones that were able to gain their biomass in carbon dioxide enriched conditions. And it seemed like for if the folks are interested, you should read this paper. It was published in Science, and it's actually a pretty nice paper to read. They found that C4 plants were really able to, in the carbon enriched conditions, they were really able to cycle nitrogen much more. And this was what was promoting their growth as compared to anything related to temperature or drought. And this is just to illustrate how these long-term experiments are so important for us to see or to predict what might happen to a future, in a future climate to these complex communities, right? But community is fine, ecosystem is fine. Eventually, species are going to respond to changes in the climate as individual species, right? And in theory, you can have many different ways in which species might respond. So like I said, depending on the features of species, whether you're temperature tolerant or not, how well you tolerate drought, are you going to benefit from a certain nutrient cycling that now comes up in a new climate? You might have a crash in your population as as you're trying to move in order to track a changing climate. Or you might also gain populations because now the conditions are suddenly more favorable for you. So in this graph, scientists were sort of, the people who were thinking about this, they presented many scenarios or the kinds of responses that species might show to a changing climate. And mainly in order, to their argument was that species would try to track their favorable climate. So they might move across a latitudinal gradient, like moving from low to high latitudes or moving from low to high elevation. Or if you're a marine species, you might move from, across the depths of the ocean to track the kind of conditions in which you evolved and which are best suited for you. And this might happen in many different ways. Your populations might crash or go extinct while you're trying to track the climate. You might have a range shift, like you're not exactly covering as much space as you did before, but you're still managing to hang on. Or you might have some species might have a range expansion because now there is a wider range of climate conditions that is favorable for them. And a lot of the science for climate change is actually trying to track what is happening and where are these changes kind of happening. And in one of the first very comprehensive such attempts, Chen et al., in a paper that they published in Science, they found that for many species that they examined, there was clear evidence that species from the tropics or from the lower latitudes are actually seeing a shift towards higher latitudes because now those areas are getting warmer. And so spaces that were not available to these species at some, a few hundred years ago are suddenly conducive to many of these species. So we're seeing this shift along, from lower to higher latitudes, and similar shifts, although not as prominent when this study was done, from low to high elevations, suggesting very clearly that at a global scale, species are moving to try and track the climates that they evolved in. And some places on Earth are going to be more prominent do this kind of species movement, range shifts, and climate tracking than other places. Because mountains, for example, are spaces where, in a very small, relatively small spatial scale, you actually have huge turnover in species composition, because there is also very prominent turnover in the climatic conditions. Now, as it gets warmer, we are going to find that low elevation species are probably going to keep moving upwards and upwards. And scientists are finding such evidence for a wide variety of taxa, including amphibians, lizards, and birds very prominently. And as one example, there is this study that they did in the tropical Andes by Freeman et al., where they found that, as expected, when you compare the data on bird species occurrences and abundances, that was made, that was taken, I think it was taken about 30 or 40 years ago, and they compared that data to the bird species occurrences and abundances today. And what they found, what you see here in green, red, and gray, when you see green, it means that these are actually species that have seen an increase in their in the range size that they have in the mountains. Red means they've seen a decrease in the range sizes, and gray means that they wouldn't have, seen, there's not too much of change that has happened. And by and large, the data showed that the higher elevation species had declined. Most of the reds that you see are there in species that are at higher elevations. See, the ones that are at higher elevations are the ones that are also experiencing range contractions. And so most higher elevation species were actually declining or having range contractions, and they were also reducing in abundance, to the point that some species that were really common but restricted to only mountain tops had completely disappeared. Like this entire bar is red, which means they were just not there anymore. And based on this data, the authors also argued that these mountaintop extinctions will probably be very likely in the tropics, because temperature gradient is much sharper along the mountains in the tropics compared to temperate areas, and play a much stronger role in controlling species range limits. So based on first principles of ecology and based on physiology of species and how they've evolved to respond to temperatures in tropical and temperate regions, they indicated that tropical mountains might be extremely vulnerable to a reorganization of biodiversity because of communities disassembling in some parts and reassembling into novel communities in other parts, right? And now, if you have these changes in species moving and tracking and going all over the place, clearly you're going to have winners and losers. But another thing that's going to happen in a novel climate is that new species or species that have never interacted before are probably going to interact, or competitors, are going to interact in conditions that they never experienced together before, right? Again, a great example is that of species in mountains. So you can have this plant species from the lower elevation, which was unable to tolerate the cold, dry conditions at higher elevations, but now with climate warming can start moving upwards, right? But what that means is that it is going to experience novel competitors. It also means that the species that was sitting there at the higher elevations are going to experience novel competition. So what decides the winners and losers in this competition is going to be really important for us to understand in order to predict what kind of communities we might see in a changing climate in the future, right? And in this really very nicely done experiment, Alexander et al., this was done in the Swiss Alps, if I'm not mistaken. They took these species from the lower elevation and transported them or transplanted them into higher elevations. And they checked what happened when these novel interactions or when these novel competitors were experienced by different species. And clearly, as expected, the responses differed between the four species that they used in the experiment. In the context of there being a current climate and competitors, when the climate gets warmer and they have the same competitors. And the third experimental treatment was when the climate is warmer, but they meet novel competitors. Now, again, in these graphs, the more negative value means it's a larger detriment. So it has that in that situation, you're being hit harder in more negative ways, right? And of course, we see when you look at the white bars, whenever there's a competitor, species are gaining less biomass, or their fitness is reduced when there is a competitor in the scene. But what we clearly see for most species, although there are differences in the magnitude of this effect, is that when they are in a warmer climate, even with current competitors, they seem to be gaining, or they seem to be getting hit. We don't know exactly why this is, but the paper does have some details and some discussion on why this is. But very prominently, when species meet novel competitors, these mountaintop species, when they're meeting novel competitors, they're actually getting hit harder when these species from the lower zones are coming there and imposing novel competition on them. So suggesting that in the future, this is one mechanism by which mountaintop species might start getting knocked out by these novel competitors that are coming in, right? And this is not just about this kind of winning and losing, and these kind of reorganizations and reassembly can also happen because of changes in trophic interactions. So again, plants, I love plants, I work with plants, and I think tomorrow Vinita is also going to talk to you about how plants are so cool. But particularly for plants, many of the dynamics of plants communities are actually mediated through invisible interactions with the other organisms around. So for example, soil microbiota is one big thing that regulate plant communities. Insects, fungi, nematodes, there are all of these things that regulate plant communities, and even the success of many plant species. For example, those that rely on mycorrhizae might not be able to do well in a new climate context where the mycorrhizae can't exist. So that is another thing that scientists are, and this is actually a frontier area of research where scientists are trying to understand what kind of role would biotic interactions play in determining what you see for a certain group. So for example, if you take plants, would this disassembly and reorganization of communities be driven by whether or not its associated soil microbiota can move from low to high elevations? And we can immediately think of three clear scenarios, right? One where the low elevation biota can establish at the high elevation, but the plant can't, because we saw that competition, in the previous slide, the previous example, that competition was knocking things out. But there's also a scenario where the biota the biota doesn't move, and therefore the plant might be able to move but can't quite establish, and where both of them move, right? So these three scenarios are now being examined by scientists to see which of these might be might be driving some of the changes that we see. And of course, it's not static, right? Like what happens in a Mediterranean mountain would differ very much from what happens in a tropical mountain, because also of historical and biogeographical factors that have shaped these interactions in the first place. So there's a lot going on here, and a lot for us to know, that scientists are becoming very curious about. And interactions are generally fascinating, right? So recently, IPBES published a report in which they again sort of issued a warning to humanity, saying that it appears as though pollination is going to be one of those interactions between plants and animals that is going to be hit pretty strongly by climate, because pollination is so tightly queued in between these two groups of organisms, right? Like plants have to release these, they have to flower at a certain time, they have to be able to attract the pollinators through their flowers, either by the sight, smell, or by the release of chemical cues. And then insects have to be around and tune their life cycles to the availability of these floral resources. And all of these delicately fine-tuned balances can be disrupted just like that if, let's say, that the plant just flowers a little earlier because now it's warmer, or if the insect matures a little earlier before the plant flowers. But in general, this is another very cool, very important, and slightly scary area of research, because it seems like there are a lot of these pollinator interactions that seem to be, that seem likely to be disrupted in the future. But and there are also many knock-on effects that happen because of species moving and trying to track climates. And in this very extensive, very and recent study that was published in Nature, this group of scientists pulled together a lot of data on species occurrences, and they modeled what kind of species are likely to co-occur when you're in a future climate. right? And the reason they wanted to do that is, and these are just mammal species, they wanted to see that, okay, if there are novel species interactions that are happening, does it also mean that there is a potential for novel pathogen exchange and sharing to happen? And they did find the evidence that suggested that viral sharing events are very likely to increase, and particularly so in some geographic locations, when in a near future or in a changing climate of the future, species are going to interact with each other that never interacted before. And so this is obviously of human concern as well, right? This is affecting biodiversity, mediated via biodiversity. But this emergence and evolution of newer pathogens is clearly something that can affect human disease and human epidemiology, as well as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic too, right? Uh, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this change to the, these changes to the climate or changes to biodiversity, the fate of biodiversity in a changing climate is not going to be limited to just the climate, because at the same time, biodiversity has to now deal with many other changes that are happening, right? So some of these changes also act synergistically. Habitat fragmentation, or the breaking up of once large contiguous blocks of habitat into smaller pieces, being a great case in point, right? Um, Many of these fragmented habitats are actually these feedbacks that are set up such that fragmented habitats become warmer and drier, and processes that are or the effect of fragmentation on many species can actually interact with the effect of climate events, particularly extreme climate events, and decide the population or determine the population trajectories of species by acting on their life history events. So, for example, if you take dispersal or reproduction, which are very key life history events for species to either colonize new spaces or to maintain their populations, they can be affected by both habitat fragmentation and by extreme climate events, right? So, in this graphic, where this group of scientists was trying to talk about how need to be looking at or using ecological theory to understand the interactions between different stressors on species, these large scale stressors, we need to consider how a certain life history event might be affected by both habitat fragmentation or deforestation, and also when you superimpose a climate event. And they came up with these different scenarios. But this graphic was to illustrate that whatever might be happening to a species would not probably happen just because of one isolated driver, but increasingly we may need to look at multiple drivers acting synergistically or in concert to understand what the eventual fate of these ecological communities is going to be, right? And an example here is again found in forests. Um, do excuse me for all the forest examples, but I am, after all, a plant community ecologist, so that's what I sort of fall back on most of the time. But one of the great examples here of these kind of, fragmentation climate interactions is that across the world, this study compared the ability of forests to buffer, like the forest microclimate to be buffered from the macroclimate because of there being intact forest cover. So this graph or this data that you see on the left of the screen from this paper by Defreen et al., it took data from all of these places across the globe where they had paired recorders for many, many years in a forest and in an adjacent ecotone at the edge. Right? And what they found was, when you look at the blue, which means that forests they tend to be cooler than the adjacent ecotone or edge, they found that almost generally across the globe, forests tended to be cooler both in terms of the maximum temperatures they experience and in terms of their mean temperatures than the adjacent edge. But interestingly, when you look at the minimum temperature, which is how cold forests or how cold that environment gets, forests also had a buffering effect there. And it turns out that these places where the minimum temperature was actually kept warmer than at the edge were these boreal or temperate forests, where it is the lower temperatures which can actually be a more detrimental microclimate for many plant species. right? But this could potentially have, these microclimates could potentially also be important for organisms like lizards and other amphibians that are quite temperature sensitive, and this kind of buffering might be important for them to maintain their habitats, or to remain maintain viable populations in many of these habitats. And when you have deforestation and fragmentation taking place, where you create more and more and more edges, and these edges tend to be warmer and drier than the cool, humid conditions that we find in interiors, you are compromising the ability of these forests to buffer the microclimate, right? And many of these loss of buffering capacity can actually lead to species extinctions. For example, if you take plants that are sharpened and need cool, humid conditions, a warm, dry microclimate, and an increase in the proportion of a warm, dry microclimate in this forest because of fragmentation would actually make these species much more vulnerable to a future drought or a future climate event than it would be had the forest been there in total. So an example of how these kind of interactions take place. And this also reminds me of a study that was done on amphibians, which found that their temperature sensitivity to amphibians was a huge predictor of how well they survived in fragmented forests, and or was a prominent predictor of how well they survived in fragmented forests, probably being mediated by the buffering effect of forests, or the loss of the buffering effect when the forest gets fragmented, right? And another interaction, or another co-stressor in a changing climate, can be that of invasive species. Now, for a few hundred years now, actually more, humans have been moving species all around the globe, but in the last few hundred years we have made some really massive movements of these few species that have taken over systems in and natives, and caused havoc to native species, right? One such story is the story of when the brown tree snake was introduced in the island of Guam. In this condition, or in this situation, the brown tree snake, I think, was introduced to Guam about around the time of the Second World War. So it's not that long ago. But within about 20 years of its introduction, people who were working there, not even scientists, like people who were living on the island, people who were marine soldiers who were posted on the island, saw that there were drastic changes to the kind of forest that you found in the island. And it turns out, a recent study actually figured out why this is happening. It turns out that this is happening because a brown tree snake eats birds, and birds which never had a predator before were now just getting eaten up all over the place. Many of these birds eat fruits of trees and disperse the seeds and help with the regeneration of the forest, and uh, create the forest structure as we see it and as we know it. And what this study found was, when this seed dispersal process is disrupted, the forest that ends up coming up in places looks completely different. And so the introduction of an invasive snake had these multiple long knock-on effects that has now today changed the forest structure and the tree species composition in Guam, giving a great example of how some of these changes that that humans mediate can very rapidly have drastic impacts on the ecosystem. So again, think of it now, now this altered forest composition might react very differently to a changing climate than an original forest might have reacted. So in all of these examples, we spoke so much of what's going on. So one of the questions is, does it all matter? Any of you who have read anything in paleontology would know that across or through Earth's through the time that life has been on Earth, we have had major, massive extinction events. There being 5 large extinction events. So why should we care about this one, right? Is if the Earth has gone through changes and has come out of it, yes, we have lost species, but we have also gained species, and we have kind of, the Earth has maintained itself, or biodiversity and life on Earth has maintained itself. So why is today different? Well, one thing is, what the data suggests is that even though there were massive extinctions before, what we see today, the rate of extinctions is about 1,000 times more than it has ever been in the geological past. And it is primarily human driven. The only difference today is that most the these forces that are these earth system changes that are leading to these extinctions are actually driven by humans. And so we being a sentient species, we being self-conscious and self-aware species, the question becomes, do we then have a moral responsibility to try and pull back from some of the actions and activities that have led to the situations that we have today? I don't think there's any easy or one word answer to that, but just something for us, I suppose, to think about in terms of what is our moral culpability, and do we want to hold ourselves responsible for this? And if yes, how do we want to go about rectifying what our actions have done to biodiversity on this planet? Right? And this problem is huge. That's what I have kept repeating. Um, to and as ecologists, as scientists, we only address, each of us individually only addresses parts of these problems. And despite there being some studies that have been long term, despite these massive experiments that are set up, we are still only still scratching the tip of the iceberg, of probably a fast melting iceberg. Uh, but one of the things that we have seen is that it is now more than ever really important that we understand how biodiversity is structured in different parts of the earth. What are the ecological principles that govern what kind of species get together to form a community, and what kind of interactions then form an ecosystem? And these kind of information today is becoming more important than ever to predict how biodiversity is going to look and might respond to these ongoing changes that will have effects on these systems as we know them for quite some time to come. And with that, I'm ready to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very insightful talk. Really enjoyed listening to it. Audience, if they have any questions, can post it in the chat section. I'll be reading it out.
Should I keep my screen on, or do I stop sharing?
Oh, since the presentation is over, I think you can stop sharing.
Okay, right. Okay, great. Yeah.
So meanwhile, I'll ask a question while they are
Okay, sure.
okay.
Yeah.
So you were talking about all these forest experiments, right? Which were conducted over the years. Like, and you also told like you are scratching the tip of an iceberg which is melting fast. So this experiment takes like a long term. These are like long term, like 2 to 3, 4 years. Sometimes you also
Mm-hmm.
mentioned about 20 years long experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So as a person in our lifetime, how much can we contribute towards this? Like not as an ecologist or a
Mm-hmm.
researcher,
Mm-hmm.
as an individual human being, how can each person contribute to the, you know, to stop this? That's what like, because these results take a long time, right, to get out.
Correct.
So
Yeah,
meanwhile,
yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Fatima, if I have an easy answer to that. I guess so some of the the answer to that question probably has nothing to do with ecological science, right? It has how humans, or most of us, can contribute is in ways that in terms of changing our behavior, in terms of changing our consumption patterns, in terms of living lifestyles that are more sustainable. So reduce, reuse, recycle, that is one thing that we all can do, right? Make small changes in our life. There are a lot of not ecology based, but there are scientists who are looking into more the sustainable aspects of living, right? Like what happens when you get your food products, when you eat certain kinds of food products, which food products have the largest impact on the earth, like, and what kind of impacts. Like some foods might be leading to carbon dioxide emissions, but some foods are leading to deforestation, like oil palm. All of us love chocolates, but every Cadbury chocolate probably has oil palm that has been sourced from the deforested, or that was once forest in Indonesia, or in Borneo. And so I think becoming more mindful of the way we live our lives is probably the best way, or one way that I can think of, in which we can all cut back on the damage that individuals are doing. And I know that doesn't sound it's not easy, because we live in a really complex world, right, which is outside of our control. It's not like we are determining what the trade routes are going to be like. We are sort of, then there's so much information that we need to know sometimes that it can be overwhelming to make these changes. But don't let that get, I don't think it should, we should let that get us down, but maybe just try and use as little as possible and be as mindful of what we use. And that would be a great first step towards addressing some of these. But also being aware, just being aware of what is happening around us, like where are the major deforestation events happening, and how is that happening because of certain consumption patterns that maybe we have. Those might just be things that just being more aware might be a good first step in this regard.
Thank you, ma'am. We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
It's from, wait a second. Oh, it's from,
Can I see?
yeah, you can see. It's from Hardan. How El
Uh-huh.
Nino and La Nina affects the Indian biodiversity and ecology pattern.
Good question. I'm, we don't actually know this very well yet. We know over the last, some of my observations over the last few years have been that when we have these El Nino years, we tend to have slightly drier years. We tend to have less of, in the forest at least, we tend to have less of recruitment. But I'm, this might be my ignorance, but I'm not sure, or I'm not aware of studies that have explicitly looked at this, the effect of El Nino on Indian systems. Much of the effect of El Nino, because it happens so prominently in the new tropics, has been examined in other places. Like the Amazon, for example, there have been a lot of studies on what happens during El Nino years versus the La Nina years, but not so much perhaps in Indian systems. And this is something that's open to research.
But there must be some effect, right, on in Indian. But there must be some
Hear you, there must be some.
effect on Indian biodiversity and ecology.
Well, yes, there must be. Like I said, I think the El Nino years, even in India or in the Indian subcontinent, they tend to be warmer and drier than the usual. And there are some, but a lot of our systems are actually driven by the Indian monsoon. And by and large, it's the changes to the Indian monsoon that affect eventually have an effect on biodiversity. But like I said, we don't know. I don't think we still have analyzed the data to know, for example, if let's say if there are effects, El Nino years, do they have any effect on birds, or do they have any effect on the kind of reproduction that happens in trees in terms of forest productivity? We just haven't done those analyses yet for India. I'm sure there might be effects, but I don't have the numbers to tell you for sure what those effects are.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's a question from Arul. So,
Uh-huh.
invasive species invading a particular biogeographical area is only a human induced effect, or it can happen naturally too? If so,
Ah,
are there any examples known of?
okay, yeah. So, yes, species can move to areas naturally, and in some ways, these changes that we're talking about with respect to climate and species tracking their climate is um, a, a range shift or a novel range expansion of species that happens. And sometimes these species that are not, that have naturally gone on to colonize a new area, they they become part of that system. And invasive species, the term specifically is used in those cases where species that have been introduced by humans have ended up having a detrimental effect, a noticeable discernible detrimental effect on the system otherwise, on the native species otherwise. In some cases, introduced, so there is a difference, right? It's introduced species, and some these introduced species can just become a part of this native group of species that are already there, and in that case it is called naturalization. But in some cases they cause a lot of damage, and that's when they're actually thought to be invasive. So it's a matter of terminology of what you call invasive. So technically there is nothing like natural most of the time we use it in the context of species that humans have brought in. But in ecology, the term invasion can just mean any new species coming in and being able to establish itself in an area. But in terms of the way it is used, biological invasion is generally thought to be a human driven phenomenon. That's how we use it.
But what do we really mean when we say that that particular species is becoming a part of the ecosystem? Because if a new species is coming in, then it will cause some amount of damage to the pre-existing ecosystem, right?
No, not necessary. That's the thing, no? Like it need not cause damage. In many cases, it does. And I think that's why it has become like it has attracted research. But there is a phenomenon called naturalization, in which species that are like novel in a particular or like ecologically and evolutionarily novel in a particular habitat or in a particular place become, they get established, they are able to reproduce and maintain a viable population, but they don't cause any kind of detriment to the populations of other species or to the kind of interactions between species that are happening. So only those species that actually cause a detriment are the ones that are technically termed invasives. So it's not necessary that it happens, but in many cases it does happen.
Oh yeah. Okay, that question is resolved. So we go to next question. It's from Jyoti Sharma. If species are shifting with latitudinal gradient, what are the methods to measure it? As field-based study will be labor as well as money expensive.
Oh yes, yes. So I think a lot of people who have done these kind of studies, which, as you correctly pointed out, it can be extremely labor intensive, they have relied on historical data. So they have sourced data from like 150 years ago from naturalists who went out and recorded the ranges of these species and where they were found, and then they matched it to what kind of data we have today, more recent records of the ranges of these species, right? And which is why we don't have this information for most species we know of. What we are the inferences we are making are based on from the best available data. um, and so there are two things there. Yes, of course it's extremely intensive to do this work. Not too many people, and in some cases maybe logistically infeasible to do it. But people also use the existing information on, say, or scientists use the existing information on species ranges to model what kind of climate they might occupy in the future, because now we have the ability, like the computational ability to model the climate. So that's when we are predicting that, oh look, we are likely to see a latitudinal shift. And then for species for which we do have the data, like 200 years ago they existed from this latitude, that latitude, what proportion of those species are actually showing the kind of shifts that we predicted? And that is what scientists are generally using so far. But hopefully with the increase in biodiversity inventories, with a larger effort being made across the earth to coordinate biodiversity inventories, we might have more data to look at some of these patterns in the future. And some of these things are also going to be governed by the interaction between different human mediated changes that I spoke about. So for example, it's all very well to say that, oh, species are going to track their favorable climate across a latitude or across a mountain, but if there is habitat fragmentation, the species may not be able to move. So there are those problems also that come in and that we might need to account for. Just something to keep in mind, that this is where the interaction between different global change forces also comes in and becomes quite important.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Neville. He is asking, what do you think is the best approach for dealing with invasive species?
Oh my God, that's a big question. I don't know whether we can answer that so simply, because there are so many different kinds of invasive species, and that's where the biology becomes really important. So the way you would deal with, an invasive mussel in a lake, as has happened in North America, for example, is going to be very different from the way you deal with Lantana camara, which is a plant that has become invasive in India. But to give you a more general answer, I think we need to study the ecology of that invasive in relation to the ecology of the native communities, right? What does, like someone was asking, what does it mean for it to be invasive? What kind of damage is it doing? And therefore what kind of and what makes it tick? Are the forces that made it invasive? Is it because it's doing really well in this particular climate? Is it forming novel, as a plant for example, is it forming novel interactions with soil mycorrhizae? Is it getting dispersed really well by certain animals that eat its fruit? Is it There are just so many ways that invasives in a particular environment might be doing well. So I think the first thing would be to, it would be very species specific, very context specific. So we do need to first understand the biology of why something has become invasive and what it is doing before we can think of designing management strategies to control it.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
I
Do
have
we?
one more question related to the graph
Yes.
that you have shown while
Uh-huh.
presentation, the biomass versus the year of C3 and C4 plants.
Yes. Yes.
Uh, so how so it's much more challenging to do you consider, do you observe a particular species or different species, because it's much more challenging because here the life expectancy of a particular species matter. So
Mhm.
how you overcome these challenges?
So
It's a long term observation or long term
right.
project. So how you can overcome these challenges?
Right. Well, some of those challenges are really hard to overcome. That's what I think I keep repeating. But in the graph that I showed, it was actually an experiment in which they used, I believe, four C4 species and four C3 species. So definitely, like you highlight, the more species you add, the more complex these patterns might get. Um, but and there are some cases where there are some species that you may not be able to compare because of the time scale of responses and all of that. So yes, there are these challenges, and that is just the inherent nature of ecology, I suppose. It just maybe teaches us that there are certain questions that we have limits to answering with the resources we have today. But the way to get around that is to really do with the resources we have at hand, try and design a study that is most representative of a system that you are interested in, right? So in this case, for example, the 8 species that they chose makes up maybe more than 80 or 85% of the biomass in those grasslands that we were talking about. So yes, they're not representative of the entire diversity, but they are representative of what's happening at the ecosystem or for that particular ecosystem fairly prominently. But in many cases, like some of these studies have been designed such that instead of focusing on species, you choose your experimental or you set up your experiments using species that represent different traits. So species that span a range of seed sizes or a range of leaf traits, and then you see check how these experimental treatments in terms of enhanced carbon dioxide or higher temperatures or drought might be affecting species based on their traits. And the generality of this approach is that any other species that might have this or similar trait, or you can predict along that suite of traits for a species that may not have been included in that experiment. So there are ways scientists go about dealing with this problem, that you can't do an experiment on everything for a long term.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, do we have any more questions?
I think Madhulika has a
Yeah, there's
question.
one
I
more.
see it in the chat
Yeah,
box. Yeah.
yeah, we have
So
one more question
Madhulika
from Madhulika.
asks, should I read it out?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Madhulika asks, as you mentioned, habitat fragmentation prevents shifting of species. In that case, what will be the fate of the species? Yeah. Um, well, there is evidence now to show that fragmentation might actually increase extinction rates because species are not able to move, right? So remember that graph or that graphic in which I showed how the different possible responses of species in terms of their range shifts, there is extinction. So range shift assumes that the species are actually able to move to colonize a new area. But if that colonization doesn't happen, so for example, if dispersal is compromised, it is one possibility is that that species might get extinct. A second possibility, which is maybe less drastic or less disappointing, is that the population of that species just becomes more and more restricted. So what might have once been a fairly abundant species now becomes rarer and more restricted to certain pockets of favorable climate and available habitat that is unfragmented. So those are some of the possibilities that might happen.
Yeah, I hope that question is resolved. Any more questions before we close the meeting? Oh, it seems like, okay, there is one more question. Are there ways to rejuvenate barren lands?
Well, that depends on what you call barren lands. In India, there is a huge mistake or a misnomer in, for example, labeling grasslands as barren lands because there is no tree cover, right? So I think, of course, I might be stating the obvious, but just to emphasize the point, what is barren needs to be quantified, and that differs whether you are in a, what the baseline condition of that ecosystem was. What is barren for a grassland versus a savanna versus a tropical rainforest can be very different. And again, I go back to what I was answering someone else with respect to the invasive species, is that I would, let's say, call it a degraded ecosystem instead of a barren land. And again, repairing or restoring that degraded ecosystem to a certain reference level that we might want to is really contingent first and foremost on understanding the biology of that system, which is just the basic ecology of how species function, what are the kind of nutrient, the biogeochemical cycles that make the system the way it is, how do species interact with one another. And again, this doesn't mean that we have to understand everything, but we do have to get into and make sure that we grasp the basic biology, the most fundamental aspects of how the system works, and then use that to design the principles that will allow us to restore these patches. So for example, in some places, people are using the knowledge of the interactions between plants and their mycorrhizae to improve the outcome of restoration species that plant species that you put in there in order to restore a degraded system by inoculating it with its mycorrhizae from the soils and other places. So biology is still very important.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any more questions? Yeah. So, yeah, if it's a no, thank you, ma'am, for having on board with us. It was great having your talk here, and all of us enjoyed the talk. It was very informative and helpful. So again, we have a next talk as a part of the Green Talkies on February 9th by Dr. Vinita. It's about plants, so I hope you join. And all of the others present here, please do join for the same. It's on Feb 9th, the same time, 7 p.m. Thank you,
Thank you
ma'am.
so much.
It
Thank
was
you
a
again
very
for having me here. I'll try to join Vinita's talk for sure. Yeah. Take care. And this is a great initiative. Keep going, guys. Very nice.
thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
Bye.
coming.